Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. Or should I say, Edaxi Sinadelphi, Yasaske Kalimera. Greetings from the beautiful city of Athens, Greece. So, today I'm going to try to make good on one of my promises, and we're going to read something together. And what I propose we read is a wonderful article about the one and only Jacques Lacan. The article is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is always an excellent source. A little bit technical, sometimes a bit difficult to read, but in general, if you can read Stanford Encyclopedia, from my experience, always has been a wonderful resource to use. And the article is by Adrian Johnston. Adrian Johnston from the University of New Mexico. The article was written in 2013 and revised in 2018, so it's a fairly fresh article. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of things I want to say about Lacan, and in general, if you want my personal take, I have a video about, a lecture actually, about Lacan and Heidegger. The link to that is in the description. We're going to read the article, and I think I'm going to give my thoughts throughout the article, and maybe after we're done reading with it, I'll make some closing observations. But for now, let's jump right into it. So this first section deals with general introduction and biography of Lacan, which is something I always, absolutely always, invariably skip. There might be some interesting insights, so I don't feel it's appropriate to skip a part of the article. This video I'm going to cut when we finish biography, and then we're going to continue. In the second section, which is fundamental concepts, the register theory and imaginary, symbolic, and the real, which for my money, these are the main concepts of Lacan. This is kind of what Lacan is synonymous with in my head. So we're going to deal with that in the next video. But again, hopefully some interesting insights are going to come from here as well. Last thing I want to say before we jump right into the text is that reading Lacan has been maybe the most singular, the most powerful experience, philosophical experience of my life. Can't quite remember right now, but I was a young student. I was a bachelor student at the time, and I've read Ethics of Psychoanalysis. This is a particular seminar of Lacan, and it wasn't exactly any particular concept that I've seen there, but just in general, the way that Lacan deals with human subjectivity, with human nature, with what it means to be human. And specifically, again, this notion that I keep talking about, for me, the most important idea of this teleological versus mechanistic worldview. And in an important respect, I think that in Lacan, for the very first time, I saw exactly this properly mechanistic worldview, seeing a human being as a product of forces, as a complicated system, right? Not seeing a human being in these judgmental terms that we have immortal souls, that we have that we are evil or sinful, or that we have duties, we should be ashamed, we should be guilty, right? None of that. So what I saw in Lacan, and in psychoanalysis more broadly, but especially in Lacan, is this view from the outside, a third person, neutral, diagnostic, mechanistic, descriptive perspective on the human beings. And the immediate feeling that I've had, that it has imparted in me, is this beautiful feeling of elation and liberation. I don't want to overshare too much, but I imagine as well as so many other people in our culture, think of Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse is going to talk about how the dominant impulse of the superego of our time, of our day, superego, über-ich, the over-I, right? The part of the psyche, if you want, most closely associated with, most easily, readily associatable with the idea of conscience. So what our parents, our society, our schools tell us is that we need to be productive. We have to be productive. Reminded of Max Weber, right? This interesting parallel between Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. This Protestant idea that, Christian idea in general, but a particular Protestant spin on this, that human beings are born sinful, that we are evil. We should be constantly feel ashamed and guilty and work, productive work. This is a particular Protestant and particular kind of proto-capitalist take on the Christian predicament, right? That we should not, let's say, mortify our flesh or just suffer as ascetics, somehow, go through these ascetic exercises, but that we should do work, productive work, especially work which is good for others, right? Productive social work, our station in life. Like if you're born a peasant, be the best peasant that you can. That this is your vocation, and engage in this as if this was, religious duty, as if this was ascetic enterprise, right? And for me, as well as for so many other people I know, again, growing up with, to some extent, complex of guilt, complex of shame, reading Lacan was extremely liberating, right? And again, it's also very important that even though kind of this is liberating, Lacan is a very pessimistic philosopher, and we have to remember that, again, after Nietzsche, after Freud, after Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, after Darwin, right, we don't actually think of any kind of substantial human subjectivity to be liberated. So Nietzsche, Freud, Marx are anti-Cartesian in this sense. We don't believe in this Cartesian subject to simply be liberated, right? Because again, there's no such thing as a human being. Death of the subject, death of the author, right? Human beings are products of these larger forces of biological and cultural evolution. We are emergent. We are constructed by these larger forces, for lack of a better word, right? And so you cannot talk, properly speaking, about liberation. Any form of any kind of liberation can only be a different form of determination. So I think that there's an important critical negative aspect in Lacan, if you want, critique of ideology, critical theory. But then once you take away the excessive repressions, the surplus repressions, again to borrow a term from Marcuse, you need to substitute something for that, substitute something in its place, right? You need to rebuild yourself somehow. And again, Foucault's hermeneutics of subject, this idea of going back to the ancient Greeks, this idea of care of the self-discipline, building yourself up, becoming your own master, right? And for me, this is always, there are connotations of cognitive behavioral therapy. Of course, cognitive behavioral therapy is pedestrian compared to Lacan, but I do feel that there's that there's an important connection there, that to some limited extent, techniques of cognitive behavioral therapy can be used by Lacanians. Anyway. Enough talk. I'll have an occasion to repeat all of this, I would imagine. Let's jump right into the text. Thank you so much, Adrian Johnston. People who don't believe in communism. This is Communism at Work. Wonderful, beautiful article by Adrian Johnston from the University of New Mexico, available completely for free. This is not a commodity to be sold on the market. This is the free gift of Adrian Johnston to entire humanity. Communism, proof of concept. Anyway, this is I often talk about what makes me pessimistic. This is what makes me optimistic, that you have such beautiful articles freely available on the web. Anyway, feel free to read along. Jacques-Marie Émile Lacan, born in 1901, died in 1981, a major figure in Parisian intellectual life for much of the 20th century. Sometimes referred to as the French Freud, Lacan is an important figure in the history of psychoanalysis. His teachings and writings explore the significance of Freud's discovery of the unconscious, both within the theory and practice of analysis itself, as well as in connection with a wide range of other disciplines. Particularly for those interested in the philosophical dimensions of Freudian thought, Lacan's oeuvre is invaluable. Over the course of the past 50 plus years, Lacanian ideas have become central to the various conceptions, to the various receptions of things psychoanalytic in continental philosophical circles especially. So even though Lacan himself was a psychoanalyst and had a medical training, the most important reception is of Lacanian thought is in philosophy, actually. And there's a lot to be said about this. Partly, I think partly this is an indictment of this is a defect, a drawback of contemporary medical practice and contemporary psychiatry and psychology. To be a good psychologist, I think, or psychiatrist, I think you need to be a good philosopher. But good philosophers are hard to come by. I may be wrong. This might be prejudicial, but this is my preliminary understanding. But on the one hand, on kind of at the end of the day, I don't really care about these disciplinary boundaries. What we are trying to do is we're trying to lead a good life. If doing philosophy is helpful, wonderful. If doing psychology or psychoanalysis is helpful, wonderful as well. Anyway, so section 1, and we're going to finish the video here with section 1. Historical overview. Medically trained as a psychiatrist, and again, we're going to look at this down the line, but Lacan had medical training and medical practice. He actually worked with patients who were deeply suffering, psychotic patients. And again, very often students, especially first-year students, have this temptation to say, oh, how do we know what is good? How do we know what is evil? But if you've ever had experience with people who are suffering from deep mental health problems, and I personally have had first-hand experience like that, vis-a-vis yourself or vis-a-vis people who are close to you. I've had a close friend of mine have a psychotic episode in front of my eyes. Like, there is no question. Barring extreme Cartesian skepticism, there is no question that the person is suffering and needs help. And so this is, to me, this is some form of, again, of a pragmatic, practical antidote against skepticism. And, we can see in Marx and Nietzsche to a lesser extent, and maybe in Heidegger and in Lacan to a larger extent, this anti-skeptical, anti-Cartesian bent that, again, we are thrown into this world and we cannot choose our values. Our values, to some extent, are given to us. I mean, we can negotiate them to some extent, but to a large extent, our values are given to us. And, well, again, you can do certain things to rewire your brain, but that's not an arbitrary process. Anyway, let's continue with the reading. So, medically trained as a psychiatrist, Lacan's first text started appearing in the late 1920s, with his publishing career really taking off in the subsequent decade. And Lacan didn't like writing. something kind of, to be not particularly modest, something I share with Lacan. I hate. Well, anyway, no. Let's not talk about hate. Let's talk about productive. The Socratic spirit of the dialogue, live speech, as opposed to the dead word. The 1930s see several early Lacanian milestones: the publication of 1932 of his doctoral thesis on the paranoid psychosis in its relation with the personality. Then also the collaboration with the surrealist and the Dadaist artistic movement, very interesting, in whose midst he circulated as a familiar fellow traveler. Entry into analytical training, including a didactic analysis with Rudolf Lowenstein. Attendance at Alexander Korzhev renowned seminars on Hegel. Korzhev, say hi to Korzhev. So specifically, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit by Alexander Korzhev. Then the first presentation of the now famous theory of the mirror stage at the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1936, a presentation which was infamously truncated by Freud's friend and biographers. Lacan was not allowed to finish his presentation properly. Lacan always had trouble with the official establishment of the, kind of psychoanalytic institutions, official psychoanalytic institutions. And then the appearance in the Encyclopedia Française in 1938 of a substantial essay on a sizable swath of analytic topics by Lacan, again entitled The Family Complexes in the Formation of the Individual, attempt at an analysis of an analysis of a function in psychology. The crucial period of Lacan's development, as the immediately preceding already indicates, was marked by the collision of interests and influences related to psychoanalysis, psychiatry, philosophy, art, literature, among other areas. So again, Lacan on the intersection of psychoanalysis, psychiatry, philosophy, art, and literature. Yes. Very important kind of interdisciplinary approach, something I applaud and admire in Lacan. More specifically, the robustly interdisciplinary combination that came together for Lacan at this time of Freudian analysis, Hegelian dialectics, Korzhevian pedagogy, and different experiences of madness, say hi to Foucault, from numerous perspectives, indelibly colors and permanently inflects the entire rest of Lacanian of Lacan's intellectual itinerary. So again, immediately we talk about Freud and Hegel and Kojève. Yes. Unsurprisingly, the Second World War was for Lacan, and of course for history generally, a period of disruption and upheaval. His psychoanalytic activities were interrupted, including his training analysis. Lowenstein and Lacan did not concur about whether the analysis was well and truly completed, with Lacan deciding it was over, and somewhat controversially, never returning to Lowenstein's couch. The war provided Lacan with an exposure to military psychiatry in both France and England. Again, war, tragic part of human experience, but to a very large extent, it seems inseparable part of human experience, at least up until now. Communist utopian dreams notwithstanding, dreams of perpetual peace. Anyway, the war provided Lacan with an exposure to military psychiatry in both France and England, and his 5-week visit to England, acquainting him with aspects of British psychoanalytic world. Features of this visit are recounted in British Psychiatry and War, published in 1947. A handful of important texts were composed during and after the war, all of which eventually got reprinted in Lacan's magnum opus, Écrit, published in 1966. So this is specifically logical time and the assertion of anticipated certainty, a new sophism. Also, presentation on psychical causality and aggressiveness in psychoanalysis. So all these are published in 1945 to 1948. And of course, the mirror stage as a formative of the I function as revealed in psychoanalytic experience, delivered in 1948 at the International Psychoanalytic Association Conference in Zurich. Anyway, so this is 1948. This is the second delivery of the mirror stage. The first delivery is 1936. Delivery in Marienbad is lost. This version is surviving one made canonical through its inclusion in the Écrit. Anyway, the next decade, so I would imagine the 50s, was pivotal in Lacan's trajectory, the time when he fully came into his own as a leading analytical thinker of great originality and immense import. A veritable explosion of Lacanian material was unleashed during this period, including 7 annual seminars. Lacanian seminars. The Ethics of Psychoanalysis is one of the seminars I alluded to. And many of the most celebrated essays and subsequently collected in the 900-page Écrit. A number of these were hyper-condensed distillations of the results of the annual seminars. At the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, so the decade is the 40s, at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, Lacan became initiated into and conversant with the structuralism of Ferdinand de Saussure and its inheritors such as Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roman Jakobson. By the way, we should definitely do at some point, hopefully this year, something maybe of a seminar on structuralism, so especially Lévi-Strauss. But Saussure and Jakobson are also extremely interesting, I would say. So this is kind of a note to self-note for the future. Lévi-Strauss's 1949 book, The Elementary Structures of Kinship, helped launch the French structuralist movement that flourished during the 50s and the 60s in an orientation that challenged the theoretical primacy of existentialism in France. So turn away from existentialism towards structuralism is something I'm very sympathetic to. Lévi-Strauss's structuralized anthropology, so Lévi-Strauss structuralized anthropology and Roland Barthes structuralized literary cultural studies, and Louis Althusser structuralized Marxism. Yes, so all of these are very important. So Barthes and Althusser as well. Talked about Althusser and his structural reception of Marx a little bit in our reading of the Stanford Encyclopedia article by Jonathan Wolff about Marx. Anyway, up through the end of the 1950s, in 1959, 1960, a fundamental reorienting shift arguably occurred in Lacan's thinking. Lacan fairly can be portrayed as likewise structuralizing Freudian psychoanalysis. He did so under the banner of Return to Freud, according to which, as his most famous dictum has it, the unconscious is structured like a language. The unconscious is structured like a language. Complicated, important, yet to some extent cryptic phrase, which we will need to try to understand. L'inconscient est structuré comme un langue. Comme un langage. L'inconscient est structuré comme un langage. I have to work on my French pronunciations a little bit. Lacan portrayed himself as the lone defender of Freudian orthodoxy, in danger of being eclipsed by its alleged abandonment and betrayal in the post-Freudian analytic universe, particularly Anglo-American ego psychology as consolidated by the troika of Hartman, Chris, and Lowenstein, Lacan's former analyst. Lacan adamantly maintained that a Saussurian-assisted recovery of the overriding significance of language for analysis. Hang on a second. So Lacan adamantly maintained that a Saussurian-assisted recovery of the overriding significance of language, so its significance, right, for what? Significance for analysis, both clinical and metapsychological, is the key to faithfully carrying forward Freud's revolutionary approach to psychical subjectivity. All of this was announced in detail in the lengthy founding manifesto to Lacanianism, the 1953 Écrit, the function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis, often referred to as the Rome Discourse. This manifesto coincided with Lacan's participation in an exodus from his former analytical institute, SPP, and the founding of a new institute, SFP. The SPP's move to a medicalized model of analytic training, scientific psychiatric paradigm that was dominant in the English-speaking world, was one of the main precipitators of the departure of the breakaway faction that founded the SFP. So I could comment on this, but I'm not sure how important this is. So you have this Anglo-American reception of Freud that Lacan didn't like. So you have this Anglo-American funded because Anglo-American world had much more money and to some extent maybe much more clout. So they had these kind of run-ins. For my money, my understanding is that Anglo-American reception of Freud is much more shallow. Lacan didn't see eye to eye with them, but as it sometimes happens, yes, in our capitalist world, money wins, and so Lacan was forced to break away to some extent. To some extent, he wanted to break away because he didn't agree with the Anglo-American kind of led psychoanalytic association, and so he founded his own, called the SFP, Société Française de Psychanalyse. Anyway, so also in 1953, Lacan conducted the first annual seminar addressing Freud's papers on technique. Lacan continued giving these seminars right up until shortly his death, with the seminar, Le Séminaire, running continuously for 27 years. 27 years. That's impressive. As was the case with Kojève, Lacan exerted his influence primarily through his oral teachings. Oh, this warms my heart. So, keeping the Socratic legacy alive, live speech. The first decade of Le Séminaire was, so 53 to 63, was taught at the Hôpital Sainte-Anne and had an audience consisting mostly of psychoanalysts. For reasons I will explain shortly, the article will explain shortly, Lacan in 1964 moved his seminar to the École Normale Supérieure. Some of you may be familiar with so many brilliant students coming out of the École Normale, people like Foucault or Althusser, for example. So seminars were held at École Normale Supérieure from 1964 to 1969, and then to the Faculty of Law across from the Pantheon, 1969 to 1980. From 64 onwards, Lacan's audience startlingly increased in both sheer number and breadth of backgrounds, with artists and academics from various disciplines across academia joining the more clinically minded attendees. Le Séminaire became a nodal Parisian intellectual institution, a kind of hub attracting some of the brightest stars of the post-war French cultural firmament. For instance, philosophers such as Jean Hippolyte, yes, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Luce Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva spent time in Lacan's audience. In his seminars, Lacan deftly maneuvered within and between a multitude of theoretical currents, putting psychoanalysis into conversation with history of philosophy, phenomenology, existentialism, structuralism, post-structuralism, feminism, and, as already indicated, just about every discipline represented in the university. So let's look at this. History of philosophy, phenomenology, existentialism, structuralism, post-structuralism, feminism. Yes, very interesting, very interesting. Anyway, all of the major French philosophers of the generation that came of age in 1960s and 1970s engaged with Freudian analysis in one way or another. All of them did so in fashions varyingly informed by Lacan's teachings. In the 1960s were a highly productive and equally tumultuous area in Lacan's history. In his 7th seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis, oh yes, this is actually my favorite seminar for no particular reason, mostly for just biographical reason. So Lacan took a sort of turn faithful for the direction of his later trajectory, initiating an interrogation of the ways in which language was privileged by his 1950s return to Freud. So language. The immediately prior years tirelessly emphasized the essential role of the register of the symbolic, namely the pride of place of the analytically modified version of the Saussurean signifiers in the structures and dynamics of the unconscious. And speaking objectively, in the 1930s and 40s, the phenomenal visual register of the imaginary was to the fore, thanks to the focus on the mirror stage. Okay, so let's just unpack this a little bit. So, this very important phrase, that the unconscious is structured like a language. And the way that Lacan understands language, what does it mean that the unconscious is structured like a language? Is that the unconscious is a structure. This is the symbolic register. We're going to talk about this more down the line. But it's a symbolic register, right? Which is structured like a language understood on the model of Saussurean structural linguistics. So if this is not perfectly clear right now, don't worry too much, but kind of the way to understand the unconscious for Lacan is to see it as analogous to language, and the way to understand language is to see it through this lens of Saussurean structural linguistics. Anyway, and so in the, I would imagine, so we talk about, so in the 1940s, the idea is that the imaginary was on the foreground. So the 40s is the decade of the imaginary. Then the the 30s and 40s, the imaginary. Then the immediately prior years, we talk about the symbolic. So the imaginary, here the symbolic, and then at the end of the 1950s, we have the rise of the real. So these are the three registers. Is this important? I'm not so sure, but I mean, you see what the author does here. So he talks about how Lacan moves, again, starting in the 30s with the imaginary, then in the 30s, starting in the 30s with the imaginary, then in the 50s with the symbolic, and then in the late 50s with the real. Okay, not a difficult thought. Anyway, so at the end of the 50s, with the rise of the real as the register of a new focus of Lacan's thinking. So obviously we'll talk about this more. What does it mean, symbolic, imaginary, and real? Actually in the next section. So things and phenomena escaping, resisting, or thwarting the signifying power of the socio-linguistic symbolic order became even more central in Lacanian theory. So basically, this is what the real means. Things and phenomena escaping, resisting, or thwarting the signifying power of the socio-linguistic symbolic order. This is in a nutshell what the real is, what Lacan means by the real. These things and phenomena include otherness, drives, jouissance, objet, petit, among other Lacanian concepts. So these are very important. Let me actually make a note of them. I want to, when we're finished with reading, I want to make a list of terms. So these are very important terms. Otherness, drives, jouissance, objet, petit, We'll talk about this more. So 1959-1960 seminar. The seminar defensively can be depicted as a prescient post-structuralist text avant les lettres. Okay. An earthquake in Lacanian professional histories hit him in 1963. For 10 years, the SFP, following its creation, until the defection from the SPP, again, these are institutional squabbles and struggles in the French kind of psychoanalytic institutions, societies, right? So the SFP was being scrutinized by the IPA, by the International Association. So the SFP, so this is Lacan's society, so Société Freudienne Parisienne, Société Française de Psychanalyse. So this is Lacan's society. So he broke away from the mainstream Société Parisienne de Psychanalyse, and he was being examined by the IPA, by the International Psychoanalytic Association, because they wanted accreditation, whatever. It's petty politicking, not very interesting. But at the same time, it's like, even great philosophers have to deal with BS bureaucracy from time to time, and this is bureaucracy. BS jobs. Say hi to David Graeber, par excellence. Anyway, so Lacan basically was being scrutinized by this international American-led association, and the earthquake was that the IPA ended up offering the SFP an ultimatum that blah, 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 Lacan had to be expelled. So the IPA orders Lacan's own SFP to expel him. So he has to be struck from the list of training analysts. So specifically Lacan's non-standard variable length sessions, deviating from the fixed length session rule of IPA orthodoxy. Should we talk about this? I mean, I could explain, but not particularly. I mean, Lacan was a kind of permitted himself all sorts of liberties. And among other things, I think that the standard training sessions lasted for about an hour, and they were standardized by the International Psychoanalytic Association. This makes me bored to death, and kind of the free spirits, the free philosophically minded spirits among my listeners right now should be cringing that we are even talking about such petty things, but this is what human beings have to deal with, right? So one of the main, I don't think this was a real reason for disagreement. I think this was more of a pretext, more of a technicality. That again, the sessions had to be standard length, and Lacan had these variable length sessions, and his sessions sometimes tended to be shorter, and these are training sessions. So Lacan would analyze a subject, a patient, well, not exactly a patient, but a trainee, somebody who's going to become a psychoanalyst themselves down the line. So a psychoanalysis, a psychoanalytic session, but also a training session for a future analyst, right? And Lacan's sessions were much more free, and among other things, they were of variable lengths and shorter than prescribed by the International Psychoanalytic Association. To me, this sounds like complete madness, and this, I think everybody who had a hand in this should be ashamed that such a great philosopher as Lacan was, expelled for such petty political reasons. But that's human life. That's human nature. I talk about this ideology. I talk about this. Bourdieu has this phrase: logical reasons and pathological reasons. These are very clearly pathological reasons. Right, so people say certain things, people advance certain views, not for a deeply held philosophical reason, but because these are petty political struggles. And I mean, maybe Lacan was guilty of this to some extent. Yes, maybe as well. I'm just, I'm not saying, I'm not saying Lacan was a saint in this entire exchange. I think, as far as I can tell from his biography, Lacan was a very difficult person to deal with. Anyway. I've also heard that one reason why the International Association was so mad at Lacan, so kind of suspicious, mad, displeased with Lacan's variable sessions, is because it allowed Lacan, because his sessions were shorter, to have many more students, and so he had this kind of disproportionately larger influence in the field. Is this a good reason? Probably not, but again, petty politicking. Anyway. So the SFP accepted the IPA's conditions. So the SFP is the Société Française Société Française de Psychoanalyse. Yes. So the SFP accepted the IPA's, the International Anglo-American Association's condition, and expelled Lacan, stripping Lacan of his standing within the SFP. In the aftermath of what he understandably experienced as a deeply wounding betrayal. Oh yeah. I mean, I've also heard that, again, like Lacan, difficult person to deal with, also maybe with a fair amount of narcissism. Give credit where credit is due. Yeah. Talk about ego. Lacan apparently had a fairly, huge ego. Anyway, so Lacan, in the wake of this scandal, abandoned his original plan for a 63-64 seminar on the nom du père, names of the father. Only its opening session was given, and relocated his teaching from the Hôpital Saint-Anne to the École Normale Supérieure, and conducted his deservedly renowned 11th seminar, The Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis, in 1964 there, right? So Lacan identifying these four concepts as the unconscious, repetition, transference, and drive. So it's something we're going to talk about later down the line. So these are the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. Let's make a note. Let's add them to the list. This seminar's opening session involved Lacan's discussing his SFP brokered excommunication from the IPA, comparing himself, modest Lacan, comparing himself to Baruch Spinoza, and Spinoza's expulsion from the Jewish community for being a heretic. Very nice. However traumatic this blow, it seemed, prompted Lacan to come even more into his own, to forge a distinctly Lacanian battery of ideas and terms. Oh yeah. So whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Let's try, let's hope, let's strive, such that whatever doesn't kill us will make us stronger. Right? And difficult times, people, this kind of an important reminder. People live through difficult times, through hardship, through social upheaval, through maybe war. Lacan lived through the Second World War. Now, betrayal and excommunication from his home institution. You could even say a stab on the back, a Dolchstoß, right? But nevertheless, comes out stronger on the other side. Again, colleagues, many of us have had similar experience, maybe of lesser magnitude, of a greater magnitude. But let's try. Let's try to make the most of them. Lacan apparently was able to make the most of this. Anyway, so Lacan develops his own ideas by contrast with the more familiar Freudian language and apparatus of the first decade of Le Séminaire. So again, Lacan develops, even though I think Lacan always maintained that he was just basically explaining Freudian orthodoxy, that he was true to Freud up until his latest days. But here we see again a contrast with the more familiar Freudian language of the 50s and early 60s, and now, again, in 1963-64, Lacan breaks and, again, develops his own style to a larger extent. Anyway, although not without many precedents in his prior work, a Lacanianism distinct from Freudianism began to emerge clearly into view in mid-60s. Yes. In the shadow of his rejection by the IPA and the departure from the SFP, Lacan founded his own analytic organization, École Freudienne de Paris. This new institutional framework and freedom provided him with a setting in which to experiment with novel approaches to analytic teaching and training. In 1966, Lacan's hulking tome, Écrit, was published by Éditions de Seul. Prior to this, Lacan had published only a single book, his thesis in psychiatry. Again, something I keep returning to. Lacan kind of hated writing and was a big fan of speech. Again, this Socratic aspect of Lacan. The 900-page Écrit gathered together many of Lacan's most important articles and essays into a single volume, covering a 30-year stretch from 36 to 66. These writings provide very daunting and demanding paths of entry into Lacanian thinking, The annual seminars are comparatively more reader-friendly and transparent. So Lacan is notoriously hard to read, partly because I don't think he was very much interested in kind of speaking to a lay audience. Again, he mostly spoke to his own school, to people who understood him. And also, I think Lacan was more interested in developing his thought rather than explaining it in simple terms. This very often happens. This is one reason why philosophy is often so hard to read. Because great philosophers, again, are less interested in being clear and more interested in kind of pushing their thought forward. Anyway, so although the Écrit bears no small portion of the responsibility for Lacan's reputation as a difficult, if not deliberately obscurantist thinker, this book became a bestseller upon its initial release in France. Its success elevated Lacan into his fame as the French Freud in the eyes of France's reading public. During this time, Lacan's audience for Les Séminaires continued to swell, with his influence growing to cover ever wider circles of Paris-centered intellectuals and intellectual and cultural life. Throughout his career, Lacan exhibited a serious interest in various branches of mathematical and formal disciplines. Mathematical and formal disciplines. This is very controversial. I have to tell you, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I am not sure. I haven't made up my mind. I am somewhat suspicious of Lacan's use of mathemes, of mathematical symbolism. Take it with a grain of salt. At this stage of my reading of Lacan, I'm somewhat suspicious and not exactly very impressed. But take my words with a grain of salt. It very well, maybe, I'm not an expert, it very well may be that I need to spend some more time with them. Anyway, this goes back as far as the 40s with the recourse to game theory in logical time and the assertion of anticipated certainty. The turn to structuralism at the end of 1940s and the beginning of 50s reinforced Lacan's formalistic tendencies. So Lacan in 1950s already drawing upon not only game theory, Lévi-Straussian anthropology, and Jacobsonian's phonology, but also the history of mathematics and topology. So let's stress this. By the way, if you're looking into some sort of an introduction to structuralism and an introduction, actually including introduction to Lacan and people like Roman Jacobson, a good starting place is a Yale course on theory of literature by, I'm not exactly sure, kind of forgetting a little bit, so let me remind myself. By Paul Fry, yes. Actually also definitely need to add this to description. So the link is going to be in the description. It's it's not the easiest introduction, but it's not bad. Anyway. Yeah, so throughout 50s and 60s, more and more diagrams, graphs, and symbolizations appeared, peppered throughout Lacan's lectures and writings, testifying to a steadily intensifying trend towards formalization. By late 60s and especially the 70s, discussions of logic, topology, and knot theory were prominent, some even dominant, features of Lacanian discourse. Well, some of my students are extremely mathematically inclined. Maybe you can help me understand the insights of logic, topology, and knot theory, the insights of these properly mathematical fields, formal fields for psychoanalysis. In relation, I understand to some limited extent, I understand the usefulness of certain symbols, but I'm also, a little bit wary of too much of this. Anyway, but again, this might be just lack of experience on my part. In relation to Lacan, the 1970s could be characterized as the decade of the matheme, Lacan's neologism for a unit of formalization. So basically a mathematical style mathematical style symbolization. Distilling and fixing the core significance of a specific Lacanian analytical concept term. Lacan hoped thereby to avoid being misinterpreted in ways that Freud's deceptively accessible employment of natural language allegedly allowed most known Lacanian post-Freudians to to perpetrate. So what's the issue here? The issue here is that philosophy uses terms. It uses terms of ordinary language, and sometimes, right? And so Freud, especially, like Freud doesn't use this technical language of id, ego, superego. Freud talks about ich, über-ich, right? And S, yes? So I mean, to some extent, it's useful to use terms that are accessible to everyday language. But also philosophers and philosophical concepts very often kind of go beyond what ordinary language means. And this could be very misleading. I mean, take the word, I don't know, life, or take the word soul, or the word crime, or goodness, right? These words have ordinary meaning in ordinary language, but they also can acquire very specific, deliberate technical meaning in philosophy, or in sociology, or in social theory, right? And so sometimes there's value, and I think this is what Lacan is doing here. There's value in using specifically using technical terms. So even though Lacan could have used an ordinary language term, but no, let's have a technical term, or even better, a mathem, this kind of very abstract, mathematically, stylized symbolization, such that people who are not kind of familiar, right, cannot perpetrate this. Again, so this is perpetrate misinterpretation. So as to avoid misinterpretation. Is there value to this? I think yes. I think this is to some extent. No. I agree completely. This is a necessary problem. This is a necessary problem. Again, talk about non-self in Buddhism, or talk about the notion of forms, or ideas in Plato, or talk about spirit in Hegel. All of these concepts and terms are very easily misinterpreted, and it's a trade-off. If you don't use these simple terms like idea, spirit, or soul, or non-self, right? But if you use technical language, on the one hand, it's harder to understand you, but it's also harder to misunderstand. So it's a trade-off. Let me write this. Trade-off. Harder to understand, yet harder to misunderstand. So which one do you choose? It's a complicated question, right? But this is the choice that Lacan has made. This is coming back to one other thing I often talk about when we talk about philosophy, is that this kind of simplistic, positivist, or Popperian kind of falsificationist paradigm of knowledge, of how bit by bit you falsify or you verify or falsify. This doesn't work. True understanding, in general, like in any subject, in physics or in chemistry, but in biology, but also especially in social theory and especially in philosophy, true understanding requires a kind of a conversion, a paradigm shift, something like a Gestalt switch. Gestalt switch, right? So basically, kind of this Wittgensteinian duck rabbit, a paradigm shift, a new episteme, and you developing a new way of looking at the world. And this developing is to some extent gradual, but it also has this character of a revolution, right? In a sense of a scientific revolution. Thomas Kuhn talks about this, right? Paradigm shift, the structure of scientific revolution, that bit by bit, the old paradigm is eroded, and then all of a sudden there's a dramatic shift, like a landslide shift, like an avalanche, right? And new paradigm organically develops, and because the paradigms have different ways of looking at the world and different criteria of right and wrong, right? The debate between paradigms is not easily reducible to these simple ideas of verification and falsification. Anyway, sorry, this was a digression. Let's go back to, we're almost done. Let's go back to the text. So anyway, additionally, topology as a science of surfaces provided Lacan with resources for his regular assaults on the crude popular images of psychoanalysis as deep psychology. With these images relying upon the simplistic 2- and 3-dimensional Euclidean spheres of spontaneous picture thinking. Interesting and complicated. So Lacan criticizing the popular images of psychoanalysis, images relying upon the simplistic 2- and 3-dimensional Euclidean spaces of spontaneous picture thinking. Topological figures and constructions undermining the intuitions of this picture thinking, right, assisted Lacan in recasting the unconscious as an ensemble of contortions, curvings, foldings, inflections, twists, and turns, immanent and internal to a single plane of minded subjectivity accessible to rigorous rational psychoanalysis. So, again, without going maybe into too much detail right now, this is the one of the most vivid examples from Lacan is this Möbius strip, right? So anyway, yeah. So what is the point of the Möbius strip? Yes. The point of the Möbius strip is that it is a surface. It is a single surface, and yet this single surface has a backside and a front side. So it is this paradoxical object, right? And this is one of the metaphors that Lacan deploys against, again, this what he calls about this simplistic 2- and 3-dimensional Euclidean space of spontaneous picture thinking. Anyway, I mean, is this significant? Maybe this is significant. Let's keep this in mind, and let's continue reading. Anyway, so in addition to the pursuit of formalization via mathemes, the seminars of the final decade of So in addition to the pursuit of formalization via mathemes, the seminars of the final decade of Lacan's teaching also were preoccupied with reflections on his register theory. This is very important. This is going to be what we're going to talk about next, especially with the registers of the real and sexual differences, reflections often intertwined with each other. The program of formalization ostensibly enabled Lacan to reveal with exactitude the precise limits of the sayable and representable, thereby touching upon the real through showing what it is not pinned down fully and adequately within the coordinates of the accessible familiar reality, co-constituted through the other two registers of the imaginary and the symbolic. Yeah, this is important. So, wovon man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen, Wittgenstein says. Of what man cannot speak, of what one cannot speak clearly, right? One should remain silent, right? But Lacan disagrees, right? By the use of his register theory and these mathemes, right? He tries to reveal with exactitude the precise limits of the sayable and the representable. Because the real, paradoxically, for Lacan, is what lies beyond the symbolic order, beyond the sayable and the representable. Again, touching upon the real through showing that it is showing what is not pinned down fully and adequately within the coordinates of the accessible familiar reality, co-constituted through the imaginary and the symbolic. Yeah. Anyway, this is probably not very clear right now, but again, we're going to try to expand this through reading this article, understand this a bit more. Again, starting with the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real in the next section. I mean, my oversimplification, and I think Adrian in this article is going to do the same. Talk about so the real as a Kantian. So this Adrian Johnston from the University of New Mexico. Yes, real is something akin to Freudian, something akin to Kantian noumena, real akin to Kantian noumena, and then, so maybe even let's add this to the list. So CF Kantian noumena, or things in themselves, maybe noumenon. And then the imaginary is, like immediately accessible experience, first person experience. So basically, if you want Kantian phenomena. And the symbolic is the linguistic. Kant doesn't have language for that. Anyway, so let's continue. Various aspects and facets of things sexual came to be associated by the later Lacan with the enigmatic evasiveness of the real, including sexual difference. In one of his most famous seminars, the 20th, which is called Encore, 1972-73, so Lacan theorized sexual difference as sexuation, depicting the non-biological, denaturalized subject positions of masculinity and femininity in terms of formal logic. Therein, he purported to uncover an inherent, ineliminable structural discrepancy or gap separating the sexes, an inseparable condemnation of sexed subjects to being essentially necessarily out of sync with each other, and even with themselves as split subjects. Lacan summarized this with an infamous one-liner: there is no sexual relationships. There is no sexual relationship. Il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel. Il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel. This declaration scandalized many at the time. Moreover, the 20th seminar, in particular, as well as connected portions of Lacan's corpus, from this time period served as a powerful catalyst for the crucial development in French feminist thinking during the 1970s. So, complicated terms, let's not maybe... We'll deal with this in due course. You see, again, for me, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, this is the core of my understanding of Lacan. This stuff is less clear to me right now. Anyway, in 1980s, near the end of his life, Lacan saw fit to disband his school, the École Freudienne. This decision was controversial and triggered factional infighting amongst his followers. Lacan died in 1981. His son-in-law and editor of Le Séminaire, Jacques-Alain Millet, when he was a student of Althusser's at the École Normale Supérieure, Millet met Lacan for the first time in 1964 as an attendee of Lacan's 11th seminar. So Millet founded the École de la Cause Freudienne as a successor to the École Freudienne on the heels of the latter's dissolution. Millet has since retained publishing control over Lacan's texts, editing the Champ Freudien book series, in which official established version of the annual seminars and other Lacanian writings appear. Okay, colleagues, not too bad. We're done with the first part. Just a tiny bit of recap. This is mostly for myself. I'm going to add this to the description. These are the terms that we have looked at, noticed, paid attention to so far. So otherness, drives, jouissance, objet petit a, unconscious, repetition, transference, drive. It's definitely the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real need to be added to this. The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. In this chronological order, and I would say in this logical order. And the Theory of Literature by Paul Fry, Theory of Literature by Paul H. Fry, available on the Yale website. I'm going to add this to the description. Anyway, colleagues, reading together, not always easy, but hopefully worth it. We're going to continue in the next section, specifically jumping into register theory with the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. Hope you're looking forward to that. Hope you found the video useful. And until next time, stay safe and take care.